Sean Diddy Combs isn't just fighting for his freedom, he's fighting to hold on to his fortune. Forbes now estimates his net worth is $400 million, a significant drop from the $740 million valuation just a few years ago. But that number could shrink even more. Federal prosecutors are moving to seize assets.
The entire financial world woke up to a shock that nobody saw coming. A collapse so sudden, so absolute, so violently fast that analysts are still staring at their screens wondering if what they're looking at is even real.
Once considered a billionaire with a vodka line, a TV network, and a clothing brand, Sean Combs' fortune has taken a major hit. Forbes estimates his net worth is roughly $400 million, nearly half of what it was just a few years ago. Both his Beverly Hills and Miami mansions were raided in March of 2024 as part of the investigation into his alleged crimes. And that number may continue to drop as Combs faces a federal trial and a Justice Department forfeiture action that could cost him his empire. An empire that prosecutors allege was built, at least in part, through a pattern of criminal activity, including alleged sex trafficking, drug distribution, and violence, all used to advance what they call a racketeering enterprise. In the unsealed indictment, prosecutors outline how his business and personal assets allegedly played a role in carrying out or concealing the crimes. This means any assets connected to the behavior, even indirectly, could be seized, including real estate, companies, vehicles, and aircrafts. Now, his $60 million private jet has reportedly already been sold. The Beverly Hills estate is currently on the market for $61 million. And while Combs still owns his $48 million Miami mansion, a judge denied his request to use it as collateral for bond. In week 2 of testimony, Homeland Security Special Agent Gannon took the stand. Gannon, who helped lead the March raids of Combs' homes, walked jurors through photos of the items seized. Among them, parts of AR-15 style rifles with the serial number scratched off, loaded magazines, a Gucci bag reportedly filled with ketamine and MDMA, and personal items like lingerie and dozens of bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Prosecutors say this evidence is critical to establishing the elements required under federal racketeering laws, helping them show a pattern of alleged crime, criminal behavior used to sustain or conceal the enterprise. In an effort to protect what's left of his assets, Combs hired Stefan Casella, former deputy chief of the Justice Department's asset forfeiture and money laundering section, to fight the forfeiture action. If the jury finds Combs guilty, it will be up to them to determine how much of Combs' assets are subject to forfeiture. Anything forfeited after a conviction could be used to support alleged victims. Sean Combs denies all allegations. And to help us break down what's at stake, I'm joined by Jim Trusty. He's the former chief of the Department of Justice, Organized Crime and Gang Section. Jim, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure. Good to be here.
So, Jim, let's start with the forfeiture. This isn't just about prison time anymore. Prosecutors want his empire. From what you've seen in the filings, how aggressive is this?
Well, it looks to be very aggressive, and there's a couple of reasons I say that. The first is it's very broadly worded. What they're talking about is essentially any property, real or personal, that could constitute either facilitating property or instrumentalities, they call it, or proceeds. And so that's kind of the whole business empire of P. Diddy being at risk. And that's the second part, which is it's a RICO case, a criminal enterprise case, where they've defined the organization, the criminal enterprise, as not just Sean Combs, but as all these business interests that he has, including liquor labels, music labels, everything else you can think of. So they've set it up in a way where when they get to a forfeiture phase, if there's a conviction, the sky's...
4 years. The empire looked untouchable. 4 years. The power behind it walked like nothing could touch them. Not lawsuits. Not scandals. Not shifting markets. Not public backlash. There was this aura of invincibility. This belief that no matter what hit the system, the machine was too big to fall. But overnight, that illusion evaporated. Everything went dark. Everything froze. And the numbers that once looked like they were carved into stone vanished as if they were never real to begin with. What makes this different? What makes this collapse so disturbing? Isn't just the speed, it's the silence, the sudden halt, the complete absence of explanation. One moment the empire looked like a fortress. The next moment it was a crater. And the people who spent years praising its brilliance are now scrambling to distance themselves from the ruins, pretending they never benefited from the system that now looks like the biggest financial mirage of the decade. You can feel the fear, you can feel the panic, you can feel the desperation from those who used to orbit this empire, feeding off its influence. They're watching the collapse like spectators.
Studio, or maybe that's, his vodka line. But how does something like a vodka line, how can that potentially even be mixed up with this? How can they say that that's linked to an alleged crime?
Yeah, it's really one of two or maybe even three ways. One is if there's somehow a tie-in where that property, that business was used to facilitate the freak-offs that are in the indictment, for instance, or obstructionist behavior. So if they literally used a record studio for a party and the record studio belonged to one of his companies, you could say that that actually facilitated or was an instrumentality to support the criminal conduct. The other way is essentially if it is a proceed, if it was essentially built on money that comes from illegal activity. And then thirdly, and this is where it gets really crazy confusing, so I'll keep it short. Sometimes there's something called substitute assets where the government says, okay, we realize that that particular asset, that car, that piece of art was not actually bought by proceeds or served to contribute to the crime. But because we can't find enough to satisfy the overall amount we're owed, we're going to take it as a substitute asset. It's a very government-friendly area, this whole idea of federal forfeiture. And again, I think they're in a position where they might have their mitts on almost anything he's ever touched.
And how do they decide just that number that they're looking for? Is there kind of like a flat out number that the government, when charging with these types of cases, that they say, hey, we're looking for 50 million, we're looking for 60 million? How do they decide how much?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, that is an easier task in some circumstances where you have a fraud situation where you can tell the amount of victimization and say, well, look, it adds up to 2.5 million, and they put that in the forfeiture indictment. They don't have that here. In a drug case, for instance, you might say, well, they were responsible for 10 kilograms of cocaine. A kilogram's about 30,000. So we're looking for 3 million, do the math. Here, it's much more wide open. I think you're looking at an actual trial within a trial, if we get to the forfeiture phase, where there's going to be experts saying this is money that's untouched by any sort of criminal enterprise from the defense side, and maybe a forensic auditor from the FBI saying, here's why we're entitled to all these types of proceeds or instruments. So it is a wide open battlefield. It's going to be kind of a textbook example of how deep the government tries to reach for forfeiture if they get to that point.
At what point does that kind of strategy from prosecutors become legally risky for them, though?
That's the thing. I mean, the court of public opinion every now and then turns on forfeiture. And, the idea of forfeiture is that you don't want people to not just get away with crime, but profit from it. Being criminally prosecuted and put in prison doesn't mean that you've lost the assets. And so the idea is to kind of make things even, to hold people accountable, to not let them profit from criminal activity. But over time, you see abuses. You see situations where a person barely had a role in some sort of criminal conspiracy. I mean, literally was on the job for one day and is ordered to forfeit millions of dollars. And that bubbles up to the Supreme Court where they say this is just not totally fair. So there are abuses of the forfeiture system that are seen from time to time. I think, look, if P. Diddy, if Sean Combs is convicted in this case, I don't think he's going to necessarily gin up a ton of sympathy, but there may be legal observers that say, hey, this is a broad, overreaching moment, when they try to collect every single penny that a guy who obviously had legitimate income over long periods of his life.
Watching the fall of a collapsing star, hoping the gravitational pull doesn't drag them into the black hole with it. Because this isn't just money disappearing, this is power evaporating, influence evaporating, protection evaporating. And everyone who once clung to that shadow is now exposed. There were warnings, quiet ones, ignored ones, whispers about internal instability, whispers about payouts that didn't make sense, whispers about revenue streams that looked strong on paper but weak behind the scenes, whispers about the empire being held up more by image than by structure. But when a system is built on fear, nobody speaks loudly, and when a system rewards silence, nobody questions anything. That silence is what allowed the collapse to reach this scale. Because nobody challenged the illusion until it was too late. And when the crash hit, it wasn't gradual, it wasn't step by step, it wasn't even logical. It was like a switch flipped and the entire structure failed at once. Vendors stopped reporting payments, partners stopped receiving transfers.
And for those that do say, hey, isn't this just a financial overreach? How do prosecutors justify that?
Yeah, I think they justify it by saying, in this case, they'll say, look, two things. Number one, we didn't disable him financially pre-trial. We haven't actually locked into his accounts and taken things and frozen things where it might even affect his ability to hire attorneys or hire experts. And secondly, they say, look, it's a criminal enterprise that extended for a number of years that where he had financial profit from this kind of power and control over an enterprise. So I don't expect them to be apologetic. I mean, they may end up showing moments of moderation where they say, well, we're not going to go after this company or that company, but they've left it all on the table for now, where they can do a very broad, deeply reaching process if they want to.
And Sean Combs, he's already sold one jet. The Beverly Hills mansion of his is on the market for 61 million or so. Does that seem like someone who is confident that they'll walk, or could that work for or against him in court?
It's probably not going to be anything that's particularly admissible during the trial. It could come up during the forfeiture just to show that his overall stock has dropped. I mean, I think he's down to his last 400 million. It's a real tough spot to be in. But I think at the end of the day, you really can't draw any firm conclusions. He knows he's got a battle of his life going on right now. I mean, this is a life eligible racketeering case. Doesn't mean he'll necessarily get life. It's not a mandatory sentence. But if the facts are continue to be established of years of abusive and controlling behavior, it paints a pretty dark picture for him in terms of sentencing.
And Sean Combs, he's now brought in Mr. Casella, someone who literally wrote the book on asset forfeiture. What's Casella's role likely to be here?
Well, I worked with Steph at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland for years. He is literally the expert on forfeiture. Whenever I have a situation in private practice where I have a question mark about forfeiture, that poor guy has to take my phone call. So he's a great pick. He knows what he's doing. He knows both the process and the law, which can be a little bit different sometimes. I think he's probably, getting them prepared for the types of challenges. And by the way, I don't know this from him, but I would guess that he's basically figuring out what are the types of challenges we could raise in a forfeiture phase. What are the deficiencies in the government's approach? In other words, are they not discounting lawful employment by Sean Combs? And frankly, some of it could even relate to like how he's spending money right now. When you have a broad forfeiture allegation, it's kind of hard to figure out, are they saying that I can't get attorneys of my choosing because I'm using proceeds of criminal activities? So I think he's probably giving a lot of very sage guidance on how they walk through this process of dealing with a very broad, very deep, potentially deep-reaching forfeiture.
Since he is so knowledgeable, and since, I don't know if there's anyone who's more knowledgeable than him in this specific department, do you think that bringing him in may challenge the government's playbook at all?
I think it would certainly give them a moment of pause. Look, the reality is there's probably not a ton of time being spent worrying about forfeiture quite yet. They're probably figuring we'll get there when we get there. We got to try to get a conviction. But yeah, it's a shot across the bow. You see Steph Casella lining up on the other side, and you can say this about a lot of different type of expert witnesses and things where you say, wow, that's the king of DNA or the queen of forensic fingerprint recovery. So
Monthly revenue, gone. Licensing streams, gone. Distribution deals, suspended. Every channel that once pumped money into the empire dried up simultaneously, creating the kind of financial vacuum that only happens when the internal foundation has already been hollowed out long before the collapse becomes visible. That's the part nobody wants to talk about, because this kind of collapse doesn't happen overnight unless the deterioration was happening privately for a long time. The world only saw the explosion, but the fuse was burning behind closed doors for years. Now the analysts are trying to piece together the timeline. They're comparing old contracts, reviewing filings, examining reports that never got attention when everything looked stable. The deeper they dig, the more they find a pattern: money going out faster than it came in, assets pledged against liabilities that were already overdue, a structure reinforced through image instead of substance, and layers upon layers of financial engineering designed to give the appearance of unshakable wealth while the internal mechanism.
I think it's a shot across the bow. They'll realize that they've got somebody that really knows their stuff on the other side, but that doesn't necessarily mean they change their approach in any way at this point.
And there's this idea of facilitating property, that a business or maybe an item helped enable a crime. How direct does that link need to be?
Yeah, we should ask Steph. But yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you have to be able to show, a significant link. It can't be just like this six steps removed kind of thing. Like there was a bottle of liquor that happened to be on the bar during one of these assaults, and he owns a liquor company, so therefore, the liquor we can presume facilitated the crime. You're going to have some, quantum of proof that's deeper than that. But it's very fact specific. And again, that's why I think you're probably looking, even though a lot of times forfeiture becomes a very small afterthought to a criminal trial, this one really has the potential to be a completely independent kind of mini trial, delving into his finances, delving into issues just like that. Like, how well connected can the government make these instrumentalities, these facilitating pieces of property? I think it's, inherently pretty difficult. But again, if you use a location, that's a little bit easier. If you say I'm going to use my liquor company headquarters, or I'm going to use a record business studio to have one of these freak offs, that becomes a much tougher climb for the defense to get out of it as an instrumentality. It's these kind of third time removed ones where they might have some success.
And like how you said, we're not just talking about past behavior here. Prosecutors say that this was ongoing. Does that make asset recovery just a little bit easier for them?
Yeah, in general, I'd say yes. I mean, because you're talking about a period of years, and you're going to have, during these trials, you're going to have very specific stories from witnesses that say, I was there when X happened at this particular location. But you're probably going to get broad characterizations too. Like, he would always, use his liquor to get people drunk before these freak offs. Or there were times where we met and discussed how we were going to do this at office X or home Y, or how planes were used. It might not be a specific moment, but he might have somebody that says, I was at the airport when his private plane brought prostitutes here. So you might not have the precision that you'd have with kind of a single event trial, but you're probably going to have pretty significant stories that, again, tie these properties into the possibility of being forfeited.
How much of a role does public perception play here? I mean, have we seen the DOJ make strategic decisions based on headlines?
Well, overall, sure. We could probably point to all sorts of cases that you could, I think, fairly characterize as a little bit of trophy hunting, where the Department of Justice or even non-federal prosecutors, think this is my great case, and they like the headlines that come with it. But look, I don't think this is an example of a case that's being brought in bad faith. I think it's unusual to see a one-person RICO. It's not legally impossible. You can talk about the enterprise as being broader than the individual. And I think tactically, these are pretty smart prosecutors. I think what we should be watching for over the next few weeks are witnesses that come in as cooperating defendants who have pled to RICO conspiracy. I think that's still to come. And even though it's really not supposed to work this way, a jury takes some comfort from that. Like, there's other people that admit that this was a criminal enterprise and that they were part of it. They're actually usually instructed to not draw that conclusion at the expense of, like, Sean Combs in this case. But that's a hard thing. You hear three or four people go, yeah, I was a part of a criminal group.
Were straining under pressure. People close to the situation, the ones who actually watched the numbers up close, aren't speaking publicly, but behind the scenes, the panic is real. They know this collapse didn't start last night. It started years ago, back when the empire expanded too fast, too wide, too recklessly, back when the structure relied on maintaining fear, loyalty, and reputation rather than genuine sustainability, back when money flowed in ways that didn't match the public narrative. Now the tower has fallen, and everyone is asking the same question: how much of the wealth was ever real? The disappearance of income isn't just surprising, it's catastrophic. It signals that the empire's core was already compromised. All the signs of internal rot were there, hidden behind glamour, hidden behind influence, hidden behind the illusion of unstoppable momentum. Some insiders are whispering that the revenue streams didn't crash, they were cut. Cut because partners didn't want to be associated anymore. Cut because institutions finally had enough. Cut because the risk became greater than the reward.
It makes it a little bit easier on some level for them to convict the target of that particular trial.
Well, two questions here as a follow up. When you say, some people may come on the stand and say, "Yeah, I was a part of that group." Does that count, like as like a former assistant or some sorts? Because I know one of his former assistants took the stand and said that he set up, he allegedly set up some drugs for Sean Combs in his hotel rooms, or he provided this or he provided that. Does that count, or are we looking for more of a smoking gun?
Well, what I'm saying is tactically, it's going to be helpful for them to have people that don't just have the inside stories like that, the one you just gave, but that actually say, I'm here under a plea agreement where I've pled guilty to RICO conspiracy. It just sends kind of this emanation to the jury that this is a fairly charged case because these other people have literally put their lives on the line by pleading guilty to it. So, again, most of the witnesses that I'm aware of at this point fall into the category of victims or kind of pure witnesses. But I think you're going to see some people that are, maybe more extensively involved, more knowingly involved in some of the terrible things that happen, and they come in and say, "I've eaten this plea myself as a condition of my testimony."
Right. And we still have weeks left to go. So I'm sure the government may be bringing this up later on. But going back to the jury, at the end of the day, if Mr. Combs is convicted, who gets the final say on what's seized? Is it the jury? Is it the judge?
Yeah, it's actually the jury. I mean, I've had trials before where the jury, when I was a prosecutor, where the jury would convict. They come out of the jury room to the jury box, and they're holding on to their pocketbooks and their books and their notepads, thinking it's Friday, we're finally going to get to go home. And the judge says, "By the way, there's a second part to this trial." And they learn the hard way that the forfeiture actually falls on them. Now, sometimes the forfeiture is kind of self-contained within the guilt innocence. There's not a whole lot to do but argue how much money should be taken from the defendant. But I think this is a case where they're actually going to probably have testimony and stretch their service out a little bit by having this kind of mini trial. Again, they make the decision. Now, sometimes when things have gone badly and you're the defense and you say, we just got convicted of RICO conspiracy, how much do I want this jury to control my life? You can make a run at having a bench trial on forfeiture. You can also try to settle it, but if you want to contest it, you can say, look, Mr. Prosecutor, Mrs. Prosecutor, let's just have the judge handle forfeiture, and they will always agree to that. And then you have kind of a pared down, more legalistic type approach, which is just a judge helping calculate what the forfeiture amount should be and the sources of that forfeiture.
And realistically here, when we're talking about just the assets that could get seized, could Mr. Combs go bankrupt over this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in some ways that feels like the intention of the government when they have something that's so broadly worded. Now, they didn't put a price tag. They didn't say we're looking for $400 million, but the import of this forfeiture allegation shouldn't be understated. I mean, he is looking at dire straits if he's convicted, not just in terms of imprisonment, but because they're going to go hard after all these assets.
Yeah, very ironic coming from a rapper that had a song called All About the Benjamins. So, but I do have a question. Let's flip it here. What if Mr. Combs is acquitted on the major charges? Can he still lose parts of his estate?
He could, but it would really start to smell like an overreach by the government. And the only reason why I'd say he could is legally.
And when the financial foundation evaporates, the world that once depended on it reacts fast. People who once praised the empire suddenly act like they never benefited from it. Doors that were once wide open slam shut. Those who once played loyal now pretend they never made eye contact. Observers call it self-preservation, but it's really survival instinct. Nobody wants to go down with the sinking ship. What's even more unsettling is the ripple effect. Every industry touched by the empire is feeling the tremors. Nobody knows how deep the connections went, how many deals relied on its power, how many ventures existed only because they fed off its ecosystem. And now, with the revenue stream gone, every dependency is collapsing in a chain reaction. Companies are pulling contracts, investors are pulling funding, partners are pulling endorsements. Everyone is pulling back, fast. And as the empire's money disappears, so does its protection. For years, power insulated it, influence insulated it, wealth insulated it. But with the revenue stream falling to zero, the shield is gone. The alliances built on financial advantage are turning to dust. No money means no leverage. No leverage means no protection. And without protection, everything once buried is rising to the surface. People are starting to talk, cautiously at first, but louder with each passing day. Stories that were once whispered in locked rooms are leaking onto public platforms. Reports that were once suppressed are being revisited. Situations that were once ignored are being re-examined. And the collapse of the empire has become the trigger for a wave of revelations that nobody thought would ever see the light of day. This is what happens when an empire is built on fear. When the money dries up, the fear evaporates. And when the fear evaporates, the truth flows freely. But make no mistake, this collapse isn't just financial. It's psychological, it's cultural, it's the fall of an illusion, the fall of a narrative, the fall of a myth that lasted far longer than it should have. People once believed the empire was eternal, that no allegations, no controversies, no disputes, no internal chaos could ever bring it down, but power built on image can crumble in a heartbeat, and power built on unchallenged authority can collapse the moment the world stops believing in it. And that's exactly what's happening now. The empire is gone. The revenue is gone. The influence is gone. The silence is breaking. And the world is finally seeing what was always hiding beneath the surface.